For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Hilary Metzger. I'm a cellist. I perform with Anima Eterna. I'm with l'Orchestre des Champs-Élysées, as orchestras regularly, and I teach at the Pôle Supérieur in Poitiers and the École Nationale de Musique in Villeurbanne, and here sometimes. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the Schubert Symphony, the big C Major Symphony that you'll be performing in 4 days. I'll be discussing some of the sources, the manuscript and some editions, the instruments, and some of the musicians who played those instruments, how they were taught, how they played, the musicians who Schubert knew. That's especially oriented towards string players, because that's what I know. And then we'll be examining some of the musicians, the history of this piece, the story of this piece and its performances, and those who performed Schubert throughout the 19th and 20th century. My goal is to give you information, but above all, to give you the interest and the love of this kind of study, this kind of approach. So I'll probably be asking as many questions as perhaps I answer, but that's what I feel is part of the joy of this. Let's start with the first page of the manuscript of this piece. I don't know how many of you have looked at manuscripts. You must look at manuscripts some. It's a joy. There's so much you learn from looking at a manuscript. If you look at this one, you notice that Schubert on the bottom of the score has put trombones, cellos, and basses. Well, how do we usually see an orchestra score? Do you know? Have you looked at orchestra scores? Usually we have the woodwinds, and then in the middle we have the brass and the timpani, and then we have the strings on the bottom. And what he's done is he's sort of separated the high and the low registers. Schubert composed at the keyboard, so already that gives us an idea of how he's thinking or what he's composing. Anything else you see strange on this first page? Anything that strikes you as kind of odd? Well, what number symphony is this? 13! Okay. How many people thought they were playing Schubert's 13th Symphony? Not many. The truth is, Schubert started a lot of symphonies that he never finished. Let me play you an excerpt of one of these sketches that's been orchestrated subsequently by someone else. He wrote it for the piano. Okay, so if you include the unfinished, we have at least 5 such pieces like that. Some of them in more finished states than others, but they're none of them really complete symphonies. He thought he was on number 13. What are some other things that you see in this first page that might be interesting? Yeah?
It's those crossed out slurs.
The crossed out slurs. Glad you brought that up. That was just what I wanted. He initially wrote in this horn solo a slur that he then crossed out. Okay? And this is not just a mistake of the pen because he's done it twice in both measures. Now, I love things like this because they let us really imagine. One way of looking at it is to say, well, he wrote in the slur and he took it out. I am not going to play these notes legato at all. Or you could say, well, he had an idea of legato, but when he heard it in his mind really slurred, he thought, well, maybe not quite that. I'll take it out and I will. It lets you dream in a way that no historical edition really can. I mean, they might put it on a footnote and you might find it on page 342, but you might not even look. And this gives you information that you wouldn't otherwise have. Is there any other information up here that you see that might be interesting to you? Well, the date, which in my technological genius you see, part of March 1828. Actually, we knew from letters that Schubert was working on a great symphony in 25 and 26, and for years people called this the Lost Symphony, because they knew that this was dated 28. It actually turns out that he was starting this work much earlier. They were able to date the paper. This is a recent musicological discovery, and that Lost Symphony is almost certainly this great symphony. But that date was disturbing to a lot of people. Other thing I want you to notice, we are very much in cut time. The first edition of this that gets printed, well, of the score, it's 1849. And you see we are still in cut time here. Okay, I want to bring that out very clearly. The next edition that comes out is the Brahms Complete Edition, starting in 1884. For this symphony, it's 1885 that it gets published. Breitkopf and Hanke asked Brahms to supervise a complete edition of Schubert's works. We're in 4/4. Okay. Now, as you know, that can make a big difference if I'm in 4/4 or in cut time, especially in this symphony, especially with the fact that we're changing at one point from andante to allegro. By the way, all editions do put a cut time in the allegro. Okay, that stays in cut time. And here, we've gone from 13 to 7. That was quick. Okay. Now, you might say, wait a minute, Hilary, on my part it says number 8, and actually, I always thought this was number 9. No? None of you heard this symphony in your youth as number 9? Did that kind of trouble you? No? Did you ever wonder anything about that?
I look in the internet and I could find.
Well, let me tell you a bit the story of the numbering of Schubert, because it's actually very interesting. I too was a little surprised about this. Initially, the first 6 symphonies were known about, and so when this symphony was first published, it came out as number 7 with Brahms. They thought it was number 7. And then since the unfinished symphony was found later, it was only discovered in the 1860s, it became 8. But then they realized, wait a minute, he wrote that unfinished symphony before he wrote the great symphony. Well, we can't do that. So the great symphony skipped from 7 to 9. And there was a hole for number 7. Well, I had to put something there, so they put one of these sketches, an orchestra piece in E that actually is complete but unorchestrated, as number 7. Mind you, the number 9 symphony has particular significance at this time because Beethoven had written 9 symphonies, okay? But then musicologists said, now wait a minute. The unfinished symphony, it may not be finished, but it's playable. It's all Schubert. It's orchestrated. All those movements are complete Schubert movements. Whereas the 7th symphony, someone needs to orchestrate it to get it to be heard. We can't call it a symphony. Out it went, and we moved everything backwards. So then, this then became, we're now, on your parts you will see it called number 8. This is a modern symphony. This is what I find when I go to my local library and get a score for the Schubert Symphony because I want to prepare. Okay, we're still calling it a 7. I could not find a date on this Philharmonia score, but I bet it's very close to the Brahms complete version. Here we're back to the manuscript. This is where we change into the allegro. Okay, in the first movement, you see where I am. And notice. It wasn't allegro non troppo, it was first allegro vivace. That's also a big difference. Why did he change it? How can I do that? What would that make me think of? Please also notice the shape. We're going to talk a bit about this, of some of his dynamic and accent and innuendo. And notice, yum ba bum. Initially, it was a G. Yum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum. And he changed it to a D. Yum ba bum ba bum ba bum. That was, and because you see it in all the parts, I have actually changed it. That's also an interesting thing. Okay. Here, continuing still with the manuscript. With Schubert, we really see a difference between wedges and dots. This is not true with all composers, but if you look in his writing, you can't tell a difference. Frequently, it seems to me, at least in this symphony, I confess I'm just a cellist and I have not examined all Schubert manuscripts, so be patient with me. But in this symphony, it seems to me often he uses the lines in forte playing and the dots in piano playing. Not always, perhaps. Note the beginning of your scherzo. Note the articulations that you have in the beginning of your scherzo. Don't say anything more. What else did I want to say? And the shape of the accents. Schubert has this very interesting way of sometimes putting his accents up in the air, like this, and sometimes we don't know if it's an accent or a diminuendo. What's lovely, though, is that we can dream. We can see what he wrote, and we can think, it might have been this. Here, everything, this is our first edition from Reichhoff and Hertel, so 1849, everything has been turned into notes. For those of you who play Beethoven symphonies and have played it on Bärenreiter parts, I don't know if you've noticed, but in the cello part, there is never a dot. There are only lines. The only time you see dots is when he also puts slurs over the dots. In Schubert, this is not the case. You have both distinctions in your Bärenreiter parts. I hope that they're pretty big. And here we have the beginning of the second movement, and this is really a case where this distinction between a diminuendo, possibly, or an accent, you can really play with that, whereas it's much harder to do that in any printed version because one has to choose. You can't see the delicacy, the different possibilities. Here, for example, is the first printed version, and you see that what they've written looks very much like an accent in each case. You can't make, you wouldn't know what Schubert had really written or what he might have been thinking. Okay. I'm going to go back. So I encourage all of you, perhaps not with your orchestra piece, it's hard to find this. This is from Vienna, maybe you don't live there, I understand. But do at some point look at manuscripts, not just historical editions, which are a precious resource for us. Try to go back. It gives you much more capacity to imagine and to dream. Okay, instruments. Well, I hope all of you know that the Schubert Symphony was written for natural horns. I know the horn players know that, but maybe the string players don't know that. We have trombones. First of all, we have trombones. Not every symphony had trombones. We do. Their bores, as you probably know, are smaller. I hope you know this. I'm telling this mostly for string players. The wind players can be much more technical than modern-day trombones. And the clarinets are in C. Usually when this piece is played by a modern orchestra, it would be transposed to B flat or A clarinet, I imagine, but not for C. For string instruments, because I'm going to focus mostly on string instruments, first of all, there's an excellent book that was published after an exhibition in Vienna, the Vienna Musical Instrument Museum in 2011. They had an exhibition on early 19th century violin in Vienna, the violin in the 19th century, not just early, the 19th century. And there's a book that came out later, and a lot of what I'm telling you is based on that edition. There is an Austrian string-making tradition. This, you know probably, Steiner, Thier, Matthias Thier, Stadelmann. There are definitely wonderful Austrian string makers in that for a long, long time before Schubert. However, many of the best players in Vienna played on Italian instruments, and Italian instruments were still very widely sought after. Clément, who did the premiere of the Beethoven Violin Concerto, he was given a very expensive Italian violin by Kaiser Alexander. Mayseder is given a Strad after the premiere of Beethoven 9. Ernst plays on a 1709 Strad. Böhm probably had a Strad, we think. So I feel it's less important for a string player to say, I have to have an Austrian-made instrument when I play Austrian music or Viennese music. Great if you can. This might be different for double basses. I'm talking more about string instruments and cellos. But there could have been in Vienna a more conservative tendency into how these instruments were set up or what kind of bows we used. I say this on the basis partly of the work that Anima did for our projects, which I find very influential. There seems to have been a mix of, for example, Tucht bows. Spohr plays with a Tucht bow, we know that. He's concertmaster in Vienna for 3 years. But we also found bows like this, with heads like this, in a workshop in Vienna that was making bows. And you can tell from the heads that these are much more backwards, conservative-looking bows. They're much more classical bows in the construction. Now, Tucht bows were around for a long time in Paris. By the time Schubert has written this symphony, well, it's been about 50 years, I would say, something like that. So I'm not saying they didn't exist. I'm not saying that's historically inaccurate, but there may have been a tendency in Vienna to use more backwards-looking models. Oops, sorry. The other issue is the setup of instruments. I hope all of you string instruments know that in the 19th century, they took the cellos and violins that had been made in the 17th century and they changed them. Frequently, they found that they were too large, occasionally too small, so they cut them down. This instrument was made at the end of the 18th century, and it was changed in the 19th century. It was cut down. It's very small. It was probably made for a woman or a child to play. The angle of the neck, the way the neck was attached, in Baroque instruments, you know that they are vertical to the case, and then they were pushed backwards. They were attached differently. Baroque instruments was with a nail. They were hammered in the whole mechanism here was changed. This required a different bass bar, which would be thicker and longer inside, so the instrument had to be opened up as well. This transformation happens to a huge number of string instruments everywhere. But maybe Vienna, it wasn't happening as fast. Joseph Linke, a very famous cellist who premiered many works by Schubert, we'll be talking about him later. He dies in 1837. He always had a Baroque setup to the end of his life on his instrument, for example. So I suppose one thing you could say when you play Schubert is, I want to, or in Vienna in general, maybe I'm not with the newest model, the latest model. That's one possibility. Orchestra sizes. I'm going to be telling the story of this piece a little later, but the Second to the Sixth Symphony were read with Schubert in a friendly gathering, true, not a public performance. When they played through the symphonies, they had 7 firsts, 6 seconds, 3 violas, 3 cellos, 2 basses, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 3 clarinets, 3 bassoons, 2 horns, 2 trumpets, and timpani. I stop on the 3 because you probably know that in the end of the 18th century, at least perhaps in the 19th century, some records seem to indicate that there were more winds, that the winds may have been doubled. We're not sure about this. We're not sure that they were actually on the concert stage. They may have been employed by courts in order to serve in military ceremonies or in order to serve in other ceremonies, but it's possible that wind players in tutti sections were doubled. They were 4 or 3 playing the music instead of just 2. With Gewandhaus, in the premiere in '39, we had 9 firsts, 8 seconds, 5 violas, 5 cellos, 4 basses, and the usual number of winds. I don't know what that means, I'm sorry. That's what my source says. I can't tell you if they were doubled or solo. But notice that in each section, there were only 2 more than with what Schubert was doing in his family, more amateur setup. And that's the key word there, amateur. Because the main issue with the musicians playing Schubert's work, the main difference between that small orchestra that rehearsed at a merchant's house was that many of the people there were amateur players, whereas Gewandhaus is a professional group. Vienna, in the beginning of the 19th century, had an enormous number of amateur players performing in public venues. There was no entirely professional orchestra during Schubert's lifetime except for one. In all the other orchestras, the winds were professional, the double basses were professional, and the string players were overwhelmingly amateur players, with the exception of the concertmaster and possibly the section leaders. Did you know that for Beethoven's Ninth at the premiere, there were 44 professional and 38 amateur players? Hard to imagine. The prime example of this is the Gesellschaft für Musikfreunde. This institution is founded during Schubert's lifetime, and its goal is to play music, listen to music, try out music, and receive some theoretical, practical, or historical study in music. It's made for music lovers, amateur, but they start a concert series. They start playing orchestral concerts, and that starts in 1816. Some musicologists feel that this may have inspired Schubert to write symphonies. Who does Schubert write his symphony for? His chamber music for, sorry, his chamber music for. Do you know who he writes his first quartets for? His family. His dad played the cello, even though he was a teacher. His 2 brothers played the violin. And there's a lovely anecdote that Schubert, even very young, when they were reading quartets together and the father would make a mistake, the first time Schubert very politely said nothing, and they stopped and they did it again. And if the father made the same mistake in the same measure, he very politely said, "My dear father, there must be some mistake in the part." His father had to play. Apparently Schubert heard it. Schubert played the viola. Lots of important composers play the viola. Where are my violas? Do we have violas here? Yes! Schubert played viola. Do you know that Beethoven played the viola in the Bonn Orchestra for a while? Bach also played the viola, not just the violin. Haydn and Mozart. We got a lot of good viola players here. Okay? Good. The Trout Quintet was written for an amateur cellist. The octet was written for an amateur clarinetist. Okay? Have you ever looked at the cello and clarinet parts in those pieces? They're not easy to play. The word amateur does not have the connotation in 19th century Vienna that it does now. What does it take to play an instrument well? I mean, if you think about it. Okay, let's say you have to have a certain element of maybe like an ear or intelligence. Okay, we'll call that one way. You need to get some decent instruction, and then you need the time. You need the time to play it, right? I mean, we're not talking about, these people did have time, because when they finished their jobs as government censors or merchants or teachers, they went home and they played. Do you know that at Schubert's school, every night, there were orchestra readings or orchestra rehearsals? Wouldn't you have loved to have gone to that school? I think that would have been great. Most of those people were not going to become professional players, but they all played an instrument and they read in the orchestra in the evening. Well, you can imagine if you do that from age, I don't know, 10 to 18, you can play a bit at the end, even if you're doing something else. Schubert, by the way, he was not really a violist, he was mostly a pianist, and he was certainly not a virtuoso player. In fact, he was even worse on the concert stage because he got nervous, or if there was a famous musician in the audience. And even when performing his own pieces, people commented he wasn't always that accurate. He was very moving, but he was not known as a great pianist. With respect to the C Major Symphony, now I'm going to tell you the story of its creation. This amateur issue plays a bit of a role. Because the truth is, in the beginning, the Gesellschaft in particular refuses to play it. They didn't do it during Schubert's lifetime. After Schubert dies, Ferdinand, his brother, tries a couple of times. No way. Too difficult. No way we're going to play that piece. So finally, Robert Schumann comes to Vienna. And he sees the manuscript at Ferdinand's apartment, among other pieces, and he thinks it's fantastic, and he persuades Mendelssohn to put on the premiere with Gewandhaus. We're now in 1839. Well, guess what? Gewandhaus, they put in lots of cuts. Because not only is it hard, it's too long. We gotta cut it. That's the way everyone was feeling about it. And later that year, when it's finally performed a little bit in Vienna, they do the first movement and the second movement only. In between them, they put an aria from Lucia de Lammermoor. To soften the blow, you understand, that's the way. Okay, 1842, the Parisian musicians, they refuse to play it. 1844, Mendelssohn takes it to London. The Philharmonic Society, we're not just dealing with amateurs here, no way. He has to program an overture by Schubert instead. The first performance that is really without cuts, we believe, was not until 1863 in Hamburg under Stockhausen. Okay, 1863, the guy wrote it in 1828, that's a long time. Now, I say part of it is because people said it is difficult, or too difficult to play. The other reason they said it was too long. I want to read you a bit of the wonderful critique that Jos made reference to today in rehearsal. Have you guys read much of early musical criticism? You must read it. Schumann was not just a great composer, he wrote beautifully about music. And his critique of the C Major Symphony is one of his most famous works of musical criticism. It's been translated. You don't have to struggle through the German. You can probably find it in any language that you know comfortably. It's been translated into French too. Voila. So let me just read you a little bit of what he said about this piece. One single hearing will make us understand that this symphony contains more than a beautiful melody. More than the simple sentiments of joy and suffering expressed so many times in music, and that it transports us to those faraway places where we have never gone. Apart from the authoritative musical composition, we discover an omnipresent life, the most subtle shadings, a meaning in each instant, expression in the smallest detail. It is all bathed in that romanticism so familiar in other works by Schubert. This famous line, those heavenly lengths, himmlische Längen of this symphony, such a thick novel in 4 volumes by, for example, Jean-Paul, a novel which doesn't know how to finish, and this for the best of reasons in the world, in order to leave the reader the possibility to finish it at his leisure. Those himmlische Längen have been commented on by many other musicians since Schubert. I don't know about you, I love Schubert. I find the piece magnificent, but it is true as a performer and a listener, I have to get myself in a state, in a particular, it takes some work to be able to make it work as a construction and to be able to enjoy those lengths. It's not always an easy thing to do. Okay, well, you might listen to all this and say, now wait a minute, Hilary. Just hold it right there. You're telling me, I happen to know, Schubert didn't write this piece for a prince or a duke. He wasn't writing for the orchestras around him because no one could play it or wanted to play it. It was too hard, it was too long. Okay. He had little hopes of ever getting it published. I don't know if you know this, but virtually none of his instrumental works were published during his lifetime. So, and when he performs his own works, it's not always that polished or he hasn't spent that much time. I mean, what is he composing for? Is he composing for performance? Or is he composing out of a need just to compose? This is an interesting comment. Some musicologists feel that Schubert may have been the first modern composer. This idea that you don't compose for someone. Do you remember when we studied Haydn? And I said how proud Haydn was to satisfy his prince. He saw that as a sign of a good composer, partly. His prince was satisfied with his compositions. Schubert is not there. But above all, even if he is modern, I don't care. If he didn't care about performance, why should I? Is it historically correct to be historically informed for Schubert if he's not concerned with the performance of his piece? I would say yes. Because I would argue that even if he didn't have a specific orchestra in mind, even if he didn't think of a specific venue or a specific prince, he was influenced by the sounds, by the instruments, by the musical milieu he was in. Any artist had to be. Plus, I just find it so interesting that you're going to hear more about it. Let's talk a little bit about how one studied music in the in Vienna in the early 19th century. Most musical instruction up until about most musical instruction in general was done through private lessons. And here is a list of some string treatises that were published in Vienna in the end of the 19th century. So you imagine you have a private violin teacher, and the violin teacher says, well, go to the shop and buy the method by Kauer, or by Branitzky, or by Schweigel. No, they existed, but you know what they really used? This one. They still were basing a lot of their musical instruction for violin on the Leopold Mozart treatise. We know this because we have two re-editings of the work in the early 19th century. So that meant that publishers and the public, there was a demand for this. If you're going to re-edit something that you think you're going to make a buck, right? What's interesting about their re-editings is they also refer to the Gemignani method. So not only are we perhaps looking backwards on bows, we're looking backwards on treatises or in methods we're using. Do you see what I mean? There is this desire not to get the latest model, but to stay with what works. And we know that Leopold Mozart was a good teacher. The conservatory method, I'm sorry, I forgot the date, it's 1801. The reason why this is important, I will get into this, is because of Bode, and it is published soon afterwards in Vienna. So some people were clearly using this. And then I put down the Spohr method. The truth is, with methods, you can look at them two ways. You can say, well, I'm going to buy a method, I'm going to look at a method that is before the date of my composition, because I know the violinists might have used it or referred to it in their training. You can say that. Or you can say, I see a method as a document of how this person played the violin, how he found phrasing and technique to be beautiful. Spohr was in Vienna. Spohr was a great violinist of the time and a great teacher of the time. What he's saying in 1832 could well have reference for how people actually played in 1828. Do you see what I mean? You can look at it from both points of view. In any case, you must all, you string players, you must know this treatise, and this treatise by the end of your studies here. These are very important string treatises that should be studied. You can get them translated. You can find them. They're easy, and they're very, very important for string pedagogy. And I'm going to show you some examples from the Spohr treatise. Okay. Now the Spohr treatise was even translated into English a few years after it was published in Vienna. So you've got the early English translation. I'm talking here about martelet bow strokes. So actually, that's example 5. You can forget what he's written here. That's example 6, which he describes in another paragraph. Okay, we're talking about just lines on eighth notes. Okay. How easily readable is this in the back of the hall? Is it readable? Are you able? So I won't repeat it if you're able to follow that. What I think what you must, and I believe those of you who've been here more than once know that what we try to get you to do is to play this type of articulation in the upper part of the bow. This type of stroke, and not there, right? That's what we call the martelet stroke. That's what Spohr is trying to get us to do. Most of Spohr's examples are very much in the upper part of the bow. This he would have us play here. And not down there, okay? This idea of being able to articulate in the upper part of the bow is an extremely important element in early 19th century technique. Now I want to give special attention to dotted rhythms, which is a rhythm you find very much in the first movement, well, throughout the Schubert, but particularly in the first movement, I guess, and the fourth, a lot in the fourth. In the history of string technique, in general, in Baroque times, we played a dotted rhythm, like this. Right? And in France we were over-dotting, or not just in France, but that idea. We lift the bow out to re-attack, like that. Okay. The next bowing that is frequent for dotted rhythms in the history of things is this hooked bowing, which I have to say you see references already in the 18th century. The idea... The disadvantage about that, well, the disadvantage, what one must do is stop the bow to re-attack, because I'm not playing, right? I have to, okay. The advantage of this bowing, which occurs in the beginning of the 19th century, and not just with Spohr, although Spohr uses it in so many examples in his treatise, I came up with, I think, at least 11 examples, but probably more, is, you might call it backwards bowing, I don't know. You start on a... Okay, we've lost this bowing. We don't learn it in our modern technique. The advantage is you don't have to stop the bow in order to get to the eighth note. You can go... or you can stop it if you want. You have both possibilities. For some reason, it is easier to stay in the same place in the bow when you do the eighth note on a down bow than if you do, you wind up at the tip. To do the eighth note on an up bow, you don't get back as fast as you do when you do the eighth note on a down bow. Okay, what is the importance of this bowing? I think it's something that we should experiment with much more, and we should do our scales with this bowing. The truth is, even in the groups I play in, when people try to do this bowing, they're not familiar with it, this backwards bowing, and it doesn't always sound good. But it is often historically correct. Now, there's an exception. At the end of his treatise, Spohr has a section on the orchestral violinist, and he says, "It is of the greatest importance as regards the accentuation and for the uniform production of forte and piano. In a word, for the whole ensemble, that the up and down strokes of all the violinists performing the same part should always coincide. In order to obtain this object as much as possible, the orchestral player must strictly adhere to the old rule, which prescribes the accented part of the bar to be taken on the down bow, and the unaccented parts of the bar on the up bow. Consequently, each bar must commence with the former and finish with the latter."